You have felt this before. A sharp little sting in your finger. A tiny piece of wood buried just under your skin, and your very next move is almost automatic. You reach for a pair of tweezers sitting in a drawer somewhere in your house. Now picture that exact same moment happening to someone tens of thousands of years ago, out in the open, with no metal tool of any kind, no tweezers, nothing precise enough to grip something that's small. Researchers studying ancient tool use and injury patterns have found real evidence that ancient humans dealt with this exact problem constantly, and the method they actually used is far more resourceful, and in some cases far riskier, than most people would ever guess. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how someone 40,000 years ago pulled a splinter out of their own skin with absolutely nothing you would recognize as a tool today. If figuring out how ancient humans handled the small, constant physical problems of everyday survival is the kind of mystery that keeps pulling you in, this is exactly the territory this channel breaks down every single week. So staying nearby means the next one will not slip past you. Let's start with why this was such a frequent problem in the first place, because it says a lot about what daily life actually looked like back then. Ancient humans spent nearly every waking hour interacting directly with raw, unprocessed wood and plant material. They were building shelters from branches, sharpening tools from wood, gathering firewood with bare hands, walking barefoot or in simple hide coverings across ground littered with sharp plant debris, and constructing weapons and tools, almost entirely from timber they had just cut or broken themselves. Every single one of those actions carried a real, constant risk of small wood fragments getting driven into the skin. This was not an occasional inconvenience. For someone living this way every day, it was closer to a routine, recurring part of physical life. So the real question becomes, without a single metal tool, how did they actually get something that small back out? The most direct evidence points to something surprisingly simple: fingernails and teeth. Human fingernails, when kept at a certain length, are naturally capable of pinching and gripping small objects close to the surface of the skin, and researchers studying tool use in modern hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today, groups that offer a useful window into techniques likely used throughout much of human history, have documented this exact method being used successfully for shallow splinters. For a fragment sitting close enough to the surface, a careful pinch between two fingernails was often enough to work it free. But not every splinter sits conveniently close to the surface, and this is where things get considerably more difficult and considerably more painful. For a deeper fragment, one lodged further beneath the skin, ancient humans appear to have relied on a completely different category of tool, something sharp enough to open the skin slightly and expose the fragment for removal. Archaeological evidence shows ancient humans had access to an impressively wide range of sharp tools even without metal, including thin, precisely shaped flakes of flint or obsidian, some of which were sharpened to an edge fine enough to rival a modern surgical blade in terms of raw cutting ability. Using a small flake like this, a person could carefully cut a tiny opening in the skin directly over a deeply lodged splinter, then use their fingers or the tip of a thin, pointed tool, sometimes a sharpened sliver of bone, to work the fragment out through that opening. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you had to remove a deep splinter from your own hand using nothing but a piece of sharpened stone and your own fingers, with zero numbing agent of any kind, do you honestly think you could hold your hand steady enough to do it correctly? Type your honest answer in the comments, because the level of nerve this required is easy to underestimate until you actually picture doing it yourself. That question matters because this procedure was genuinely risky, and this is where the story takes a noticeably darker turn. Anytime the skin is deliberately broken, even for something as small as removing a splinter, an open pathway is created for bacteria to enter the body. In a world without antiseptic, without any concept of germ theory, and without antibiotics of any kind, even a tiny self-made incision carried a real risk of infection. Researchers studying ancient skeletal remains have found evidence of localized bone infection in fingers and hands consistent with untreated soft tissue infections. suggesting that what began as a minor splinter removal sometimes escalated into something considerably more serious. A procedure meant to solve a small, momentary problem could, in unlucky cases, spiral into a much longer and more dangerous one. This reveals something important about ancient daily life that is easy to overlook. Even the smallest, most mundane physical problems carried a level of risk that would seem almost unthinkable by modern standards. There was no such thing as a truly minor injury when every single wound, no matter how small, represented a potential doorway for infection with no reliable way to treat it if things went wrong. If a detail like that is catching your attention right now, that reaction is exactly why leaving a like on a video like this helps more people stumble onto the same kind of surprising history. So if it is doing that for you, this is a good moment to tap it. There is another layer to this story worth exploring, related to how this knowledge actually spread through a community rather than being reinvented by every single individual. A skill this specific, requiring precise tool selection, steady hands, and an understanding of exactly how deep to cut, is not something a person would reasonably be expected to figure out entirely on their own in a moment of pain and urgency. Evidence from how skills were generally passed down in ancient communities suggests that older, more experienced members likely handled deeper or more difficult extractions for younger or less experienced individuals, while also demonstrating the technique in the process. Over time, through repeated exposure to watching this exact procedure performed on others, younger members of the tribe would have gradually built up both the practical knowledge and, just as importantly, the psychological comfort needed to eventually perform it themselves, either on their own body or on someone else's. This detail matters because it reframes something that might otherwise sound like a purely individual survival skill. Removing a splinter safely, particularly a deep one, was likely a shared, socially transmitted piece of practical medical knowledge, refined slightly with each generation as people noticed which specific techniques led to faster healing and fewer complications, and which ones tended to make things worse. There is also strong evidence that ancient humans developed at least some instinctive understanding of how to reduce that infection risk, even without any scientific framework behind it. Certain plants with natural antimicrobial properties, identified through both archaeological residue analysis and their continued use in various traditional practices today, appear to have been applied directly onto small wounds after a splinter or thorn was removed. This was almost certainly discovered the same way most ancient medical knowledge was discovered, through generations of careful, repeated observation, noticing which specific plants seemed to reduce swelling, or the chance of an injury getting significantly worse, and passing that observation down as accumulated practical wisdom long before anyone understood the biological reason why it actually worked. There is also something worth mentioning about prevention, because avoiding the problem in the first place appears to have mattered just as much as treating it after the fact. Evidence from certain ancient tool collections suggests some communities deliberately smoothed and refined the handles of frequently used wooden tools, working the wood surface down specifically to reduce splintering during regular use. This kind of deliberate refinement takes real time and effort, and its presence in the archaeological records suggests ancient toolmakers understood, at least on a practical level, that a rougher tool handle meant a higher chance of a painful and potentially dangerous splinter injury for whoever used it regularly. Not every sharp tools for this purpose was created equal either, and the specific material available in a given region likely made a real difference in how this procedure went. Obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass, can be worked into an edge significantly sharper than most types of flint, sometimes described by researchers studying ancient tool technology as sharper than many modern steel blades at a microscopic level, though it is also considerably more brittle and prone to shattering under pressure. Flint, by comparison, holds a slightly less refined edge, but tends to be more durable and reliable for repeated use. A community with easy access to obsidian may have been able to perform a cleaner, more precise incision with less unnecessary tissue damage, while a community relying primarily on flint likely worked with a marginally rougher tool, requiring more careful technique to avoid causing additional injury during the procedure itself. Neither option came close to the precision of a modern surgical instrument, but the difference between them was still very real for the person on the receiving end. It is also worth remembering that ancient human experience with this exact problem was never identical everywhere. Communities living in densely forested regions, constantly surrounded by raw timber for building and tool making, likely dealt with splinters far more frequently than communities in more open, grass-dominated environments where wood was a scarcer, more carefully rationed resource. Climate mattered too, since certain types of wood common in specific regions tend to splinter more easily and more sharply than others. There was no single universal ancient experience with this problem, but rather countless, slightly different versions of the same basic daily risk, shaped by whatever materials a given environment happened to provide. So here is the real answer to the question this video opened with. Ancient humans removed splinters using fingernails and teeth for shallow fragments, and for deeper ones, a precisely sharpened stone flake to carefully open the skin, followed by careful extraction using fingers or a thin bone tool. It was not a clean, painless process. It carried real infection risk in a world without antiseptic or antibiotics, and it demanded a level of nerve and precision that is easy to take for granted when a pair of tweezers can solve the same problem today in under 10 seconds. Behind that simple, almost forgettable modern task lies an entire quiet history of stone blades, plant-based wound care, and generations of accumulated, hard-earned practical knowledge. If this uncovered something you did not expect, there is another everyday moment sitting right behind it that might be even more unsettling to picture without modern help. What actually happened when a piece of food became lodged in someone's throat? In a world with no understanding of emergency response and absolutely no idea what was actually happening inside the body during those terrifying seconds. That story is coming next, and it reveals something about ancient human instinct that most people have never once stopped to consider, something that has almost nothing to do with tools and everything to do with pure reflex.